Okay, so well, let's go ahead and get started. So I will kick things off. My name is Olihe Okoro. Um, I'm faculty at the College of Pharmacy here in Duluth, and I'm going to be moderating. So I am going to introduce our panelists. We have three of them, and so just to restate, this is what we call office hours with healthcare professionals. And today we are focusing on the mental health impact of COVID on children, on adolescents, and on young adults. But I'm sure we will also be able to benefit in terms of being full adults, those of us that are older adults. There will be benefit to either in what we can do to, not just what we can do to help others, but how we too can maintain our mental health. So I'm going to introduce our panelists. We have three of them here. So I'll start with Nomsebo. Nomsebo Nkosi is a licensed professional counselor currently working with the health services at the University of Minnesota Duluth. She is also currently a PhD candidate in counselor education and supervision. Nomsebo has worked as a mental health professional for 7 years. She has experience in community mental health with individuals across a broad spectrum of mental health conditions like post-traumatic stress disorders, depression, anxiety, addiction, body image issues, and self-esteem issues. Her counseling style is client-centered and rooted in the cognitive behavior therapy to empower and challenge clients' thought processes and actions on those thoughts. She also utilizes solution-focused approach, trauma-focused therapy, and other modalities and psychoeducation in addressing life challenges and other stressors. Nomsebo, you are welcome. Our second panelist is Dr. Judith Christiansen. Dr. Christiansen is a pediatric psychiatrist who provides outpatient psychiatric care with a focus on ages 4 to 18. Dr. Christiansen practices at St. Luke's Hillside Mental Health Clinic as the sole child and adolescent psychiatrist at the institution. She has a special interest in treatment of autism spectrum disorders, ADHD, and anxiety disorders. She particularly enjoys providing ongoing education to patients and their families regarding the nature and treatment of mental health disorders while working collaboratively with schools, therapists, and community supports to reach the best outcomes for her patients. When she's not in the office, Dr. Christiansen can often be found spending her downtime with her family, enjoying skiing. That's why she's in Duluth, bike riding, or playing board games with her kids. And I don't know why I get this feeling that her kids probably beat her in these board games, but we're not going to go into that right now. You're welcome, Dr. Christiansen.
Yeah, thank you for having me. And you're right, they're pretty good.
See? All right. And our third panelist is Charles Fye. I hope I pronounced that right, Charles. I'm always thinking, is it Fye? Is it Faye?
It's fine.
It's Fye. Yeah, I thought as much. Charles Fye is a mental health therapist. Charles works for the state of Minnesota as a program clinician with the Minnesota Sex Offending Program. Charles also has a private practice through the Duluth Counseling Center and specializes in working with teenagers and preteens. Charles also provides trainings to organizations on equity, diversity, and inclusion. I know he does a lot of work in, implicit bias training and so on. Charles enjoys outdoor activities. I have spoken with him before. I don't know that there's anything that he doesn't do, the whole spectrum. Sometimes I think maybe he lives more outside than inside when he's not working. Yeah, and he coaches soccer in his spare time. So very active. So you all, Charles, you're welcome.
Thank you. I'm glad to be here, and thanks for inviting me.
Okay. Well, so we're glad to have you guys. So you can see these are all experts in mental health, and so what I will do is to give them opportunity to really just talk about this last 1 year. I don't think that there's anybody that would not agree that it has been a stressful period in so many ways. But sometimes we actually lose sight of, well, what impact it actually has on younger people, especially children. I know I have been in a forum where someone was actually asking, do children get depressed? Maybe that's a question we're going to ask Dr. Christiansen later. Like, is that even a possibility? So what I'm going to do is we'll start. Who wants to start first, or should I flip a coin and just pick one person to start? To just talk to us what you have observed about, the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic here on the populations that you work with. Let's see. Charles, will start with you. I'm going to start from the back. Yeah,
all right.
I'll start with you.
Okay. All right. We all agree that this has been a year unlike any other year we've experienced in our lifetime, and it's been stressful for children. And I will really focus more on adolescents because that's my the group that I mostly work with. Developmentally, these adolescents are more apt to socialize with their friends. Their interest shifts more from family connections to, connecting emotionally and socially with friends, and equally developing, different groups of interest. Most psychology groups describe it as cliques. So what happened with COVID-19, with the shutdown, is that it took that away from them. Teenagers were more isolated from their friends, from their support system, social support system, and from the structured activities. We know that teenagers also strive with structure. And the pandemic really took that away from them. So isolation, being cut off from their support system, came with a lot of stresses, and being engaged in school online. I know a lot of our teenagers are very savvy with technology, but often they use technology as for different reasons, for gaming, social networking, and not for education. So that brought a lot of stresses. And so what is this impact? How does this impact mental health? We know that isolating brings about really negative effects on us as human beings. We are by nature social beings, and being cut off of your social outlet could have tremendous ramification. I have noticed in my private practice and from schools and teachers an increase in an uptick in anxiety with teenagers, an uptick in depression, and also a risk, great school grades and their output in school. From most parents and from data that schools are providing, there's been a decrease in their academic output. This is a stage where a lot of kids are trying to master, transitioning from adulthood or from childhood to adulthood, and they are involved in sports, trying to figure out the identity of who they are, and all of this they are missing. We know teenagers at this stage in development have an identity crisis where they're trying to figure out, who am I? What's my purpose? And being able to isolate teenagers from really exploring that identity has ramifications now and eventually in the future. So it is important, and I hope as we go, to talk about addressing the impact on their mental health now, so that it doesn't become a bigger problem in the future. Because if unaddressed, definitely it could be affect them right into their adulthood. So I'm looking forward to having an open conversations about what the mental health symptoms look like, and how, as a professional, what help I can offer parents, caregivers, and other participants on how to support mostly teenagers, because that's where I will focus my conversations today, through this crisis that the COVID pandemic and the lockdown has brought. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Charles. I have some follow-up questions because I have all teens in my house.
Yes.
So
All right.
I'll be back, but let's let's hear from you, Dr. Christiansen. So same question, just how has the last 1 year of the COVID-19 pandemic, how has it affected mental well-being, of the populations that you work with? And I know you focus from like 4 years all the way through 18. So what are you seeing, and what can you tell us?
Okay, well, I will say that the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic has been substantial. To sort of launch off of what's already been said so far, I really think about this as fundamentally altering, I'll say, to the development of today's children. What was considered certain, what was taken to be the way things always would be, suddenly was gone. None of us can conceive anything like this because we've never lived through a pandemic before. So the idea that a school could be closed and not open again in person for a year was previously inconceivable. The impact has been unique for each age group, I would say, and unique for each child, depending on the things that were already going on in their life. So there have been circumstances of children who have been in good mental health. Things have gone well for them. The pandemic comes along and parents are seeing signs something is different, something is not the way it was before. There are also the children who had, before the onset of the pandemic, who were already trying to navigate the difficulties that they were working with in terms of either depression or anxiety. It could be learning disabilities, ADHD, you name it. Suddenly, everything changed. Kids who were able to receive supports through the school system via an IEP or a 504, everything regarding that had to change. So kids who were able to receive therapy at school or speech therapy or having pull-out services, it was suddenly very hard to navigate getting that service to them. On top of it all, something that I think I get to see in my perspective as a psychiatrist, because most of my clinical visits are a blend of me speaking with my patient and then speaking with their caregivers, is that the caregiver distress was very much a part of the picture as well. Parents would be pretty forthcoming to say, I feel like I'm at my wit's end. I don't know how to help them with their distance learning. I feel like they're not motivated. I mean, it resonated with me. I have twins, boy-girl twins. They're 8.5, and I was in a similar boat. These were children who were, before the pandemic, motivated to go to school every day. They did their schoolwork, no big deal, easy peasy. We shifted over to distance learning. And the desire, the motivation to try and to learn any of those things really, really, came down several notches, we'll put it that way. And the pandemic found parents now in a dual role. So now that downtime with your child wasn't just family time. Your downtime after you were done with work became you having to be the invigilator of education, which I think a lot of families felt was like eroding just to the family harmony. So without going on too much of a long a diatribe, those are some of the highlights, I would say, for ways that the pandemic has affected today's young people.
Thank you so much, Dr. Christiansen. I will own up. I feel like I'm one of those parents whose anxiety and just being on the child, I think until I actually spoke with a friend of mine who is a pediatric psychiatrist, she practices in Canada, and she's like, okay, you need to stop. Because I was just on and venting my frustration. So thank you so much for sharing that insight. We will dig more into that. So Namsibo, we're up. You're up. Let's hear from you. What have you been seeing too, since you work with college students? So that's, a whole other group too. What are your thoughts?
Right. Thank you. Thank you so much, Dr. Olihe. So, and thank you already, to Charles and Judith. I mean, you've already just, just kind of put it out there what it looks like with the specific population that we are working with. And now the segue into looking at the young adults, Charles already said, with the teenagers, they are at that stage where they are beginning, to get there. And I'm looking at that population where they are right in the middle of, am I a child? Am I an adult? So there's a lot that is going on right now. It's like a wave, because of just their developmental stages, between the ages 18 and 24. So what I'm seeing really, it's so many disruptions that have been happening actually that have been brought by the pandemic. Firstly, I just want to highlight the biggest element of that grief, collective grief and loss. It's intense. It's very, very intense. For a young adult walking into college during the pandemic, they've already lost so much, and even if the type of loss is not obvious, we know we are working with a cohort that has just started college. They couldn't graduate. They couldn't go get prom. They couldn't, they just couldn't have some closure to that college, to high school life, and then enter college. And when they are in college, there's the pandemic, it hits. So it's different levels of loss and grief, and it's different types as well. The fact that young people and also just the community in general, there's that loss of normalcy, and that has created a lot of anxiety. And we know that college has so many, it exposes students or young people to different experiences, but with the pandemic, it really just changed the dynamic. I was looking at a study trying to understand what is going on with, of course, levels of anxiety and depression, which is what I've been getting a lot since seeing young adults. And there's a Kaiser study, the Kaiser Foundation study that they've put forward, which is pretty recent, 2020, December, I think. And they were sharing a report of symptoms of anxiety and depression and depressive disorders. And it shows that adults ages 18 to 24, they are at 56.2%. They are the highest, when compared with other adults, maybe 25-year-olds up to 49 or up to 65, it's very low. But for young adults, it's very, very high. And that is what really is of concern a lot. Issues of anxiety and depression because of all the uncertainty that young adults are experiencing, which is actually brought by the pandemic itself. I know Charles mentioned isolation. Isolation is also a big one, in another studies done by the Harvard University. It's like the percentage is extremely high because that social isolation is the one that leads into loneliness. And we know that with loneliness, of course, then there will be symptoms of depression if really things are not addressed. And we are all on Zoom right now. And I'm thinking about my young adults every day. And I always think about Dr. Olihe as well. Students are exhausted. There's a lot of Zoom fatigue, and Zoom fatigue is real. It is real. It's causing a lot of distraction where we see a lot of sleep patterns. They've been completely disrupted. Eating patterns, are different. Students either don't eat, or they eat a lot. They don't sleep, or they sleep a lot. They are on their screens 24/7 doing work. There's no screen break. And it has caused a lot of exhaustion, and it is taking its toll. And our young people, and I believe even the teenagers as well, because they are doing school, at home, and they have to be using these screens. And this is causing a lot of concern in as far as just trying to balance their lives. The distractions of also working from home, or not being at school, or being with family, being with friends. It is just causing a lot of anxiety and depression. So maybe I shouldn't take a lot of time. And also, what I'm seeing is that there's also that lack of accountability, because, young people are losing a lot of motivation. And what happens then? There'll be a lot of procrastination regarding, their academics and so on, because this is just what we are all dealing with right now as the biggest challenge. And I think maybe as an advocate for good sleep, I tend to be very, very worried when students really, are struggling because they've lost the routine. Therefore, sleep patterns are all messed up, even with eating, like I have said. And we have students or young people really that are struggling as well with eating disorders. So this has also added yet another challenge in as far as them trying to manage eating disorders, or addressing eating disorders, and learning to have a good relationship with their food. So in all, really, I just feel like the pandemic has really triggered, or has even elevated, levels of anxiety and depression. And guess what? I will not not talking about suicidal thoughts. There've been also lots of reports, and the numbers are going high, where students are experiencing a lot of crisis, and they have to be assisted to make sure that they get support and they don't act on those suicidal thoughts. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much. Just looking at the scope of what all of you have said, it truly drives home the fact that it's affecting people in different ways. Just looking at the scope of things, different ways, different things. And I like that you brought up the Zoom, just the being on devices constantly. One of my kids, the pediatrician, was actually, so because his sleep pattern is so disrupted, he's not sleeping well at all, and so she was actually suggesting, maybe let's try melatonin to see if we can, and then put him back in a structured go to bed at this time, and just see if we can get him back to, sleeping well. So I can see how that, yes, can be really very disruptive. And it has, so I would say from personal experience, not on being an expert at all in this area, but it is what I'm seeing, because it then affects his productivity and output academically by the next day. And I keep wondering, why are you not able to sit down and get your schoolwork done? So thank you for all the insights you all are bringing. So I'll ask a couple of questions and then we'll open it up. So I'm going to also just go around and ask all of you, what are some signs and strategies? So of course, we want solutions. So a couple of common signs, with the populations that you that you see, and how can we pick up on those signs, and what would be helpful in supporting, those that we know, whether they are children or our grandchildren or just our relatives or just our mentees. So Charles, let's start with you again.
All right, so what are signs? Most of the time before we even get to the kid talking about it, there are always settled signs. There are always behaviors. I always tell parents to look at changes in behaviors. It could be from my other two panelists talked about just that lack of motivation in getting stuff done. They talked about change in sleep habits. There are a lot of signs that kids teenagers or preteens might exhibit. One, you want to look for when they feel very overwhelmed when triggered. So there is a lot of inability to manage emotions. Things become so magnified that their responses do not really match what the trigger is. You start to see that lack of interest in engaging in schoolwork, engaging in other things. Some teenagers might be sleeping a lot or might not be sleeping a lot. When kids are stressed out and when they are anxious about something, they either might sleep a lot or they might have insomnia. Dr. Lee here, I know you already talked about somebody talking about putting a kid in some, sleep supporting meds. So that will keep them awake. You might start to see kids withdrawing from friends or withdrawing from families, staying in their rooms long enough, getting easily frustrated, emotionally dysregulated, lack of concentration. When the kid is not emotionally sound, they're easily distracted. I've heard, my fellow two panelists talk about even their experiences with young adults or their own kids. Kids start to lack concentration. Decline in school grades and performance, it's another one. These are signs. Appetite. For some kids, when they are stressed out, when they are anxious, when they're depressed, they either eat a lot or they don't eat at all, or they become very picky at eating. It's some of those things to watch out for. Somatic symptoms, and I'm sure Dr. Christiansen might have a lot to say about this in her practice, is, when kids start to complain, my stomach hurts, I have headaches, my eyes hurt, like when they're having symptoms that probably are not better explained by other physical conditions, I am feeling nauseated all the time, I'm eating and puking. Those are all, I think we describe them as therapy as butterflies in your stomach. When you just feel so anxious, you're feeling nauseated. You are beginning to see delinquency. Kids are beginning to be, not wanting to follow rules, very defiant. There can be talked about suicide thoughts. They are there, they are present. Kids start to experiment and get into I have had lots and lots of reports from parents. I woke up, my kid was puking, and when I found out, he had gotten into my whiskey bottle. So kids are now experimenting with drug use, drinking alcohol as a way to get rid of, because they've figured out, they are not talking. They're having these feelings that sometimes they don't have the vocabulary to talk about them, because they're just new to them, they're foreign to them. And so when they're experimenting on how to get this go, we all know when you have that big presentation and your anxiety goes up, your behaviors change. And when the kids discover that alcohol could really slow them down, and they start to get into that, which could build into other bigger problems. I have noticed a an increase in my practice in self-harm behaviors. Kids are hiding, they're cutting, self-harming, and also engaging in dangerous activities. For any kids or parents out there, boredom is a big thing. It's another sign. So kids are now looking for excitement online. And what do we know? You know, as someone that works with sex offenders, do we know? Who do we know is waiting out there? Our predators, waiting to prey on vulnerable kids, vulnerable teenagers. Increase in sexting, increase in getting into you know, sexually explicit sites, and that's just a way to stimulate them because it gives them an outlet from all this stuff they're doing. So it's really important. These are all, I mean, there's a long host of other signs that I see, but these are all things to watch out for. The key here is most of your children do not have the vocabulary to explain to you what's going on. So, and we'll get into what do I do when I'm starting to notice these things. The kids are going to communicate with you in different ways about what's going on with them before they ever tell you. So just be vigilant, watch for changes in habits, changes in behavior, and watch out for these other signs. The big thing here is hope. Teenagers, a lot of teenagers, we already know, if you're a parent of a teenager, you know that their hormones are their hormones are changing, their cognitive ability is changing, they can now think their thoughts, they are now questioning you. And in all of this, there is a lot of lack of hope that things will get better, because that's just the way teenagers think. Everything is a crisis when it's not aligned with what they expect it to be. And with loss of hope comes depression. With depression comes suicidal thought. And this is exacerbated by online bullying. Online bullying has gone up. There is no teacher there to say, hey, you know. And so when your kid is already depressed and they are being bullied online, they become, you know, they could become depressed, and suicide thoughts become a thing, and it's real. So look for cues when you find you're a teenager, or saying, you know, attempting to say goodbyes to people, attempting to give away their possessions, when you see them no longer taking their hygiene to get, you know, no longer taking care of themselves, you know, clean themselves, dressing up, there is that loss of hope, which is a very key indicator that their emotional well-being is dipping, and could lead to suicidal thoughts, and could lead to actual attempt of suicide. So it's important to start to engage your child if you're seeing your teenager, if you're seeing all this stuff. And sometimes they might actually start making direct references to suicide. They might start to Google and read about death or dying. And so these are cues that it's important for parents to be vigilant, not to stalk your kids, but be aware of what they are searching and what they are into, to make sure that you know, that you're just in tune to what's going on with your child. That would be a quick kind of summary on the things that we can watch out for. And I'm hoping that we can get into how do I help my child when I see all this stuff. One thing that I want to say is mental health in teenagers should not be dismissed as a temporary side effect of puberty. I know parents will say, no, that's puberty, no, that's puberty. Please take it seriously, and help your teenager address these challenges as they come. So thank you.
Thank you, Charles. It's as if you read my mind. I was just going to say that the summary of what you were just saying, because some of those things are things we just like, they're just being teenagers. You know, that is exactly what we shouldn't do as parents. We should not dismiss changes in behaviors and habits and all of that, and the way they're talking and all that. We shouldn't dismiss it to being teenagers. Thank you so much for just highlighting that. We'll get to you, Dr. Christiansen. What are the signs, you know, that a child might be struggling, and or that they're actually experiencing some mental health, situations, especially with children who they don't have, just like Charles had said. I mean, I'm just thinking, if teenagers don't have the words, then how much more children that are not even teens yet? I mean, how? So anyway, I'll just open it up. Go ahead and.
Sure. So yeah, I like the idea of I'll take this moment to focus in then a little bit on the younger population. So the little ones that communication is still relatively new for. Usually the keys things I will say that you'll notice for a younger child. So let's start talking about we'll call school aged, so elementary aged kids. Irritability. Irritability is a tricky one because it often will look like being disagreeable or perhaps even being defiant. But a lot of the time, if you're able to take a moment, and it's not easy in parent land, but able to take a moment and ask, does this seem really different from the kid that I usually know or have? And an example that you can kind of think of, most of us in parent land, is when there's something like, let's say your child had not gotten a good night's sleep. It's like the perfect example. You're traveling or something, you had to get up super early to get to the airport. And by that evening, the child seems unreasonable, melting down over small things not going their way, not able to have a small problem have a small response. A small problem is eliciting a big response. In the case of a child that's overly tired, it's an easier connection to make. You're like, oh, you're really tired. Let's have you go to bed early. But when there's no obvious causative agent like that, and if you're seeing that this is a pattern that is starting to evolve, that would probably be the first sign. Younger children are also well known for the somatic manifestations of anxiety symptoms. So the child that says, man, my stomach really, really hurts when they, typically just to go to school or logging on for their class, is not always necessarily a physiologic pain in their stomach. It's very easily the manifestation of that psychological or mental distress about their worries and expectations about what may happen in the school environment. Certainly appetite changes would be worth noting as well. Kids either eating much less or being very restrictive. A lot of times when anxiety spikes, our brain tries to exert control. So I'm going to exert control over this situation. Sometimes kids will be like, well, I'm only going to eat this, or I'm only going to do that. And it feels like stubbornness. It feels like defiance. But in so many circumstances, this feeling that if I can just control this is this one thing that is certain, and it is not the most adaptive or best coping mechanism, but it's one of the ones that children will employ in those younger years. I think that as we get more into those middle school years, it's a challenge because now many parents are asking, well, how much of this is puberty? How much of this is really like a psychological distress or a change? I think that when the intensity of the difficulty with mood is in a smaller range, and I think most of us can kind of feel it like, oh, a little bit touchy, a little bit moody, versus, wow, you seem very upset, or the absolute opposite, very disengaged. This is when the kid that usually knows how to make everybody, crack up at the supper table, telling their jokes, now we're not hearing any jokes. Or you're used to being able to give them a little ribbing and they will laugh and playfully kind of roll with it, but now you get barely a response. Those are the kind of things that parents can tune into if they're wanting to ask themselves or to explore, are there changes going on in terms of the mental health of my child, whether we be talking about things like depression or anxiety, which, I mean, those are the two, you know, the two biggest players, I would say, that kids are wrangling with at this point in time. I'm trying to think if there's anything else, because Charles did an excellent job. He covered a lot of the main ones. I think the only other thing I thought of, and it's going to be, it's a little bit more with our middle schoolers, high schoolers, this withdrawing into something that just completely takes them away from their everyday life. For a lot of the patients I'm seeing, unfortunately, video games has taken that role. The parents are like, I can't get them off the game system. They are listless when I ask them to turn the Xbox off. And the parents feel really distressed because when the kids cannot physically spend time together, they're thinking, well, maybe I should let you do your Fortnite campaign or something like that. But the hardest part of this is that it's never really equivocal to that face-to-face socialization. And I could, go down the rabbit hole talking about what's happening with your brain and dopamine and the nucleus accumbens, but essentially it's absorbing all of that attentional and focus energy that kids usually would have put towards other things like socializing or sports or school. So then by the time you come off of, your 6th hour on Xbox and you're looking to do your homework, like physiologically, you're kind of out of the neurotransmitters that you would have even needed to get the work done. Procrastination and avoidance are the other things that are rampant when anxiety levels really start to rise. Plenty of kids who, especially kids who are a little bit more rigid or perfectionistic. Now I have to start this assignment. I'm not really 100% sure how to do it. It's so hard to try and get a hold of the teacher. Maybe I just work on it tomorrow. And so those kind of things where it's really a change from the way your child has previously performed or functioned could be some early signs. Ultimately, the hardest part is the pause and observe. There are a lot of times where when I'm at work, and I'm silent and I'm just watching. And sometimes I think to myself, boy, they might think I'm a little bit odd, like I'm, why isn't she saying anything or doing anything? But the whole time my brain is really working and gathering information. Just those couple of times that you can just be in the room, not even speaking with your child, and just looking in, almost like you're looking in like a through a bubble and observing, can really give you a chance to take note of those behaviors and those changes in a meaningful way. Oh, and you're unmuted.
Yes, thank you so much. Yeah, I was just saying that, I like, I'm so taken by that, observing. And I also would think that, if it gets to a point where the child you need to seek professional attention, that it must be helpful for you professionals when the parent is actually able to also talk to you about their observations, because they actually took time to note those things. Yes, so that will be very helpful. Nomsibo, we'll go to you if we can just shift gears and get to helpful strategies, and then we'll start taking questions. We're already seeing, we've asked that people put their questions in the chat, and their questions that are coming up already. So if you can just go ahead and moving to, solution-based things. What are helpful strategies? And you are muted.
Oh, yeah. Okay. So, with with all what is going on right now, trying to figure out the pandemic and for and for different age groups to be able to function, we can actually, firstly, I just want to mention that we can build resilience. And I know other researchers say resilience is innate, but guess what? Resilience can also be learned. I look at resilience as one of those components of being to cope with stressful events. And I like the fact that what Charles and Judith have already stated, especially when Judith says, giving yourself time to observe, to be quiet and just observe. And you will be so surprised to see just even the elements of resilience at different stages. So with young adults, by looking at their strengths, one is able to pull out a lot. And by looking at how far they've come up to now, when the pandemic started and where they are now, it shows that they have a lot of resilience. So firstly, I just want to talk about one skill here, mindfulness. And I know that mindfulness really is one of the skills that we are now using, even though, of course, it's been borrowed from other cultures, where it is just being in the present, where someone could learn to be in the moment without any judgment of what is going on. And mindfulness is just that skill that helps one to have an opportunity to have a better perspective of themselves, because you are paying attention to what is going on. And we know that when there is a crisis, levels of anxiety are pretty high. We are never mindful. But when we use strategies like mindfulness, then you are able to even learn to appreciate and be grateful for certain things that when one is anxious or is struggling with depression, it feels like it's just gloom. There's nothing, positive about anything else. But mindfulness gives us that opportunity. And being mindful, you can be mindful about anything, the way you eat, being just mindful and paying attention to the very food that you are eating, as you are chewing, or, what's the texture like? How does it taste like? Are you even aware how it tastes like in your tongue, different parts of your tongue? You are mindful, you are there, you are in the present. When you're taking a walk, a mindful walk, what do you see when you look around as you're taking a walk? Whether you're walking your dog or you're walking on your own, what do you see? Can you smell things in the environment where you are? How does it feel like? Does it feel cold? Is it warm? So in other words, you are in the moment. And I'm not saying when you are practicing mindfulness, you don't have thoughts. We are human beings. We continue to have thoughts of different things. But at that moment, it becomes more like a reminder that says, oh yeah, maybe I'm thinking about dinner as I'm walking. But okay, let me get back to what I'm doing right now. I am taking a walk. Can I even feel, maybe the sound of my shoes as I'm, walking either on sand or on the road? What does it feel like? Am I there, the whole of me? And then meditation. Meditation is also stolen from other cultures, as we know. But of course, there are different other forms of meditation. People who are spiritual may just be quiet and just meditate. You're just quiet and having that moment with yourself. Or other people use prayer, or it could be any form. When I'm taking a walk to myself, I'm thinking, this is my type of meditation, and it makes sense. And then another coping strategy could be maintaining regular routine. I'm still pulling on sleep, because we know what sleep does. We know when we are asleep what happens in the brain. We need the brain to do its work, to do that cleansing that it needs to do. And if we don't get enough sleep, it means the brain is not doing its work. That is why then the next day, then there's more exhaustion, there's everything else that builds up, and then it creates bigger problems. And then taking a break. Let's take breaks. Let's take breaks from the screens. We are on Zoom right now. From Zoom, we go to phones. Young people use their phones a lot. If they are not on their phones, they are playing video games. They are still on screens. And if they are not playing video games, they are watching TV. That is still a screen. So take off, switch off the screen and just try and tell yourself if you could have what is known as digital detox. They've labeled it now. People who are doing research all the time. Have that digital detox so that you could find some form of equilibrium for yourself, some balance of some sort. Switch off completely, so that then you could help your brain to also, I don't know whether to calibrate or what, but just to get some time to breathe and be able to rest. And then promoting self-compassion where you connect with yourself and find the balance. I will stop there. Thank you.
Thanks, Namsivo. I know you were speaking, more to young adults and to all of us as adults, but I certainly could pick out some of those things that we could also apply to children and teens, helping them with more structure, helping them with, having those boundaries with screen time, and more structure with things like sleep and so on. We have a couple of, so thank you so much. It's so transferable, and some of those things, we can certainly modify and help our kids, even with mindfulness. If you go for a walk with them or at a meal, can we be at the table and be present and be here for the meal? It's not school time. It's time to eat, and it's about the food. So we have a couple of questions. I'm going to throw this one to you, Dr. Christiansen. It says, what do we do about some of the issues related to diet? When you have those changes in eating habits, maybe the child is, so you don't want to punish the kids for not knowing that what they may be doing is really, they don't even know what's going on. That's how I would put it. They just know they're either their appetite has changed or they're beginning to get picky about stuff. They don't want this. What do we do about this whole dietary thing?
Mm-hmm. So the answer to a degree is going to vary related to the age of the child, for starters. Younger children are typically having their meals and snacks selected and prepared for them by their parent. And so for the younger child that is becoming increasingly picky, that can be a tough one, because a lot of our parental anxieties are like, oh my gosh, well, you need to have a well-balanced diet, and it's really important for you to have a wide palate. And we kind of get at risk of our stress over their eating pattern changes, being something that is going to be forever or undoable. And so for the younger kiddos, my leaning is, if your child is getting an adequate amount of nutrition to fuel their body so that they can think for school, so they can run and play when they need to go outside, you're likely okay. The challenge is if a child is really, really, really like not eating enough to fuel themselves, then typically your next step is actually going to be a visit to the pediatrician or the family medicine doctor, because that would be means for concern, because the nutritional status of a child is pretty important for their overall physiological development, but then certainly in turn, neurological development as well. So there's certainly impacts for not having enough nutrients during these growing years. For the older child, it becomes a bit more complex. If we're talking where kids get to these ages where it's easy for them to get up and, make a mac and cheese on their own or something like that. And now you're noticing, well, all right, we're not seeing you at supper time, but in the middle of the night, much noshing seems to happen. Step one is really just to see if there's any way to try and bring the child's attention to that change. Like, hey, you know what I noticed? I think that there's been a little bit more nighttime snacking. Have you noticed that? And the unassuming approach, so not a you are doing this thing that is wrong or bad or you shouldn't, just a have you noticed is usually a nice place to start. That way it is not a shameful conversation or something that a person should feel is going to be, they need to keep quiet or clandestine. And then the next step would be to ask, how do you, what's kind of going on? Do you feel like you're really hungry? Do you feel like you're bored? Do you feel like there's something that you need? Because eating is a complicated process. Sometimes we eat because we're hungry. Sometimes we're eating because we want some type of sensory input. And so you can substitute, search for alternative inputs, and sometimes that will do the trick. If we're talking about just much increased hunger, then you start to think, well, okay, well, what are the needs? Sometimes it will seem like there's like this huge hunger spike, but then a child grows like 3 inches. And so it's a bit of a process, observing these changes over time. If you're seeing that a child is eating and eating, and then you're thinking, okay, well, you're taking in this fuel, but maybe not necessarily using that fuel, and now you're feeling slower and more tired. Hey, that doesn't sound like you're feeling all that great. Maybe we can see if we can get some help in figuring out what fuels are we going to put in so that your engine, your body, is operating in a way that feels good. In that regard, touching base with your primary care doctor, seeing if something like a referral for a nutritional consultation can be of benefit as well. Ultimately, if it feels like an alliance with the child, the outcome will tend to be better. The hardest part will be in that parenting land, when our kiddos are struggling. I mean, talk about like instant internal distress as parent. And so it can be incredibly hard to regulate, for us as the parents, to self-regulate our emotional response to what we're seeing. I mean, if there's any way to keep those interactions fairly, you almost want to say boring, just neutral, explorative, I like that curious approach when talking with children about things that have changed. It gives you a better chance of them being able to engage and be interested in thinking about these changes, talking about these changes, and then collaborating in terms of what their goals are or what they would like to see happen. And then you as the parent being the one who can then seek those supports and those supports and changes.
Thank you so much. That is just such great insight. The emotional response is our default as parents. I can I feel like I can speak for a whole lot of parents. Like the emotional response is just the default. And so, pausing and kind of like equilibrating first before you engage. I am writing that down. That is definitely, something to work with. I'm going to throw this question to you, Charles. So for those that are having difficulty through the pandemic, and it's because you've touched on this in your opening statement, do you anticipate long-term impacts, or will they improve as things get back to normal? So if people have struggled, have some things that escalated, mentally in terms of their mental well-being during this COVID period, so can we look to, things just going back, when, or are you seeing any long-term effects? And after Charles, others can pick up on that too.
All right, I will start with the good news. The good news is that kids are generally resilient. And I know Noxeba had a lot of, she talked a lot about this in her presentation about resiliency. Kids are resilient, and kids they'll get better. Now the bad news is if we let the untreated mental health symptoms go for too long, they could potentially turn into emotional problems, or place the kids at the high risk of turning into long-term emotional problems, even as adults. So, yes, there is a risk that if these go untreated, it could potentially become a long-term issue in the future. And that's why I am a strong proponent of helping the kids. And I will talk about this for my African American participants out there. I know in our community, mental health is such a taboo. It's important for us to seek help for our children and teenagers when they're struggling, and not dismiss it. The reasoning is because then what happens is the complications of mental health turns, and like I said, turns into self treatment, to say, self-medicating, to say, when kids discover drugs and other negative outlets of soothing themselves. I identify drug use, experimentation, and engaging in dangerous activities. That then the ramifications of that is the kids end up encountering their first mental health treatment when they commit a crime or when they get in trouble with the law, and then that's when it's not too late, but it's gone far enough for a kid to be entangled with the law and with juvenile system, and we talk about school to jail pipeline. It's just important for us to be aware of that and not shy away from seeking help for our teenagers. And yes, I cannot. A lot of these things can be managed at home, but there is a time when, if it starts to affect the kids' ability to complete their day-to-day activity, to participate in school, participate in sports, engage with their family, it is time to seek help, to seek professional help. It's always better early than late. And I want to talk a little bit about how to go about this with teenagers, because we know teenagers, given the fact that they are developing metacognition, which is the ability to think their own thoughts and question what we say, they can be challenging cognitively sometimes. Dr. Christiansen talked about this too. In order to bring it forward to the kid, or bring it to the kid's attention, or to the teenager's attention, it's always suggested, or I would suggest, this is what works for me: describing what you observe. This is what I observe. Talk about the changes you see. Do not blame, because it leads into defensiveness. Do not accuse, because it leads into defensiveness. Describe thoroughly what you see and engage the teenager in a warm and open conversation about what you're seeing. And in that process, try to lead the teenager to go, you know what, I might need to talk to somebody. I think this is getting, and that's when you can, because if you tell a teenager you're going to go see a therapist, they're going to look at you and say, no, you tell me why. You are the one that needs to go see a therapist, because that's the way that's the stage in which they are. They question everything an adult say, because, hey, we, before 12 and 13, mom and dad were always right. And all of a sudden, your thinking process changes, and you can actually rightfully note some faulty thinking or faulty thoughts in your parents. That's really powerful. And so they want to use that newly found, growth, cognitive developed growth in them to challenge your authority. But really staying away from accusing, dictating, and engaging the teenager in an open conversation will be a great way to start. I don't want to take up all the time, but that's
Thank you so much. We all need parenting classes before we have children. That's what I can say, honestly. So there's this question. I don't know, maybe Dr. Christiansen, you may be able to address this. Any tips for helping kids and teens deal with nightmares? And maybe I would follow up with that to say, you know, is that an indication of something? So
It's a challenge because nightmares, the first thing you're going to ask yourself is this a rare occurrence or a common occurrence? Because rare will be less concerning than common. Next would be to figure out a little bit more about, well, what are some of the, I'll call the inputs that have been going on in a young person's day. If a kiddo is having a good amount of nightmares, but we've also discovered that they've discovered an enjoyment of watching, I don't know, Stephen King horror films, but they're like 10. We might say that, you know, that may not be a great match for you. And even some older kids who just, we'll call it their temperament or their sensitivities are such that they don't tolerate that content well. That would be the first place to say, let's see if we can do something a little different. And explore if this has you feeling better. Again, you know, to launch off of that idea of not dictating, I might sound like a bit of a off the typical parenting path styled individual, but my approach, at least personally, has been, I want my kiddos to sort of see where I'm coming from when I say this is what needs to happen, or this is what I'd like you to do. Not because I say so, but because it is logical and it makes sense. I'll only get the luxury of being able to dictate things until, like age like 11, 12, and then the tables will turn. So my hope is that if I can invest in that collaborative approach now, and if I'm fortunate enough to feel like they're willing to engage in that collaborative approach, the idea is that it won't feel so foreign when we get to those ages. If nightmares are occurring, and there's no obvious source, like where's this coming from? The next question is really about the content of the nightmares. There are situations where nightmares can be part of a constellation of symptoms related to trauma. And so that would be worth exploring to see if indeed there is something that has happened or is going on for your child that their brain is now revisiting in the form of these distressing nightmares. But there are also times when nightmares in a slightly, we'll call it more benign fashion, are our brain's way of saying my day is full of stress. And so folks will talk about the nightmare where it's like, oh, I had this dream that I went to school and all of my homework was left at home and I had a test that I didn't even know about. And I say, well, okay, yeah, that sounds like, nightmare / stress dream as a possible title for it. And while for me, in my role as a psychiatrist, I mean, there are tools in my medication toolkit that can address nightmares. I would typically, for kids, if this was a persisting dilemma, I would be talking to parents about contemplating getting work done with an individual therapist, because there are certainly modalities to try and target and focus on, how do we shift what happens when we dream at night. That is a super cool level of expertise that I can refer to, but it's not in my personal toolkit.
There's a follow-up question to that from another participant. Says, what about sleepwalking or talking in your sleep?
So sleepwalking is that's an interesting one. Actually, my daughter does that every now and then. I had to do some reading of my own to remind myself about it. So it means sleepwalking it's an interesting phenomenon that can be, at least in the younger ages, so like elementary aged kids, is in that realm of can be, essentially typical. They can go through those periods of time, tends to actually be to have a little bit of a genetic component to it as well. So of course, after my daughter started to do that, and I was like, wait a minute, ask my husband, oh, really? So something like that happened around that age when you were a little kid too. The things that typically will precipitate sleepwalking are when a child ends up needing to wake up in the night, but they're not able to do it fully. And so the most common trigger for that is you drank something, some tea or some water before bed, and now you wake up and you need to go to use the bathroom, but neurodevelopmentally, your brain isn't quite getting it figured out. So you're not so asleep that you don't make it to the bathroom and have like an accident, but you're also not totally awake to be lucid and knowing exactly what you're doing. So the first step to limiting sleepwalking episodes usually is to make sure that a child is, not having too many liquids at nighttime, and certainly making a couple of trips to the bathroom before bed. That's the very first line thing, and that tends to reduce the frequency of it. Talking during sleep is, I would say you just have to see how that goes over time. If it were to be disruptive to the quality of the sleep, it might be something going to worth visiting with the doctor regarding. But for the most part, it's not something that's going to be harmful to the child, and usually it usually represents a bit of we'll call it like a discrepancy in how the brain is functioning to keep all large motor activity subdued while we sleep. So our brain is essentially, it has a job to almost like paralyze our body while we sleep. So all the stuff that we're experiencing in our dream state is not also happening out in the waking world. But when our brain is not able to fully exert that effect, that's when folks will do the talking in their sleep or having like limb movements in their sleep.
That is so interesting. I feel like we need to have more and more discussion around some of these things. We're going to take one last question here, and this is a very broad question because it's applicable to both ourselves as adults and to kids. So anybody can take this, or multiple people can respond to this. How does one know if you are providing a healthy amount of social interactions? And we talked about how that is important, with having to social distance. So we have to be physically safe and responsible. So how do we achieve that sufficiency of interaction for our kids and for ourselves as adults too? Because apparently that social interaction is needed because we're human. So how do we provide enough of that for the kids, and how do we also achieve that while still maintaining, being safe physically? That's a tough one. So any suggestions?
I will start. Social interactions, it depends on each individual. We have kids that are extroverts and they need a ton of social interactions, and we have kids that are introverts that they need a limited amount of social interactions. It all depends across the spectrum. I'll give you an example. I have an 11-year-old son who loves to play soccer, and what I discovered about him is in the pandemic, I'll be like, hey, there's an open field, let's go play now. I don't have any interest. And what I discovered about him is it was not actually the soccer. Soccer was just an outlet, a way for him to interact with his friends. And so he enjoys doing that, and now he is not doing it. And that's he wasn't meeting his social quota, so to say. And so we had to figure out different ways of getting him out there to, having like Zoom parties or whatever parties for him to really get that. So for some kids, it's a lot. They want to be, the type of kids that won't thrive in your typical online schooling, they want to be with other kids to study. Those are the kids you want to find creative ways of getting them as much person to person or peer interactions as possible. And there are others who are fine with an hour or two. So the long or short answer from experiences, it depends on each kid. But ultimately, as human, we are all social beings. It is important for a family to have an hour or so a day of no phones. Let's just sit down, share a meal, check in with each other without the distractions of electronics, and connect face to face with each other, one-on-one with each other. At the very minimum, an hour a day for a family before we all go to our busy lives. And for parents, put down that work computer, pay attention to your kid and have that one-on-one. Don't try to divide your attention, be present. That's a way to start. And if you can do that as a family and develop, Dr. Christiansen talks about that collaborative approach to communication. It comes when we are undistracted and we are paying attention, giving our kids our full attention. Whether we're a caregiver, a grandma, an aunt, you're a caregiver of that kid, being able to provide them with that attention. And that's where it would start. And as much social interactions as the kid craves, the more the merrier. There is no limit. As much social interactions and person to person as the kid craves, if it is of course pro-social. Because I could see kids running down the streets and doing things that are not to the best of their interest. I don't see any limit at all. I don't, and I will leave it to, I will pass it to my fellow panelists to see what they think.
I think that's an interesting question because indeed, every kid is unique. Some are introverts, some are extroverted, some are, my new favorite word, ambiverts, meaning which are typically like introverted, but can only do that like solo thing for a while. And then it's like, I need to have some socialization, please. And then they get that. And then they're like, I'm good. But the other part of this too, that's really hard. And I've noticed this kind of, again, for me having that lens of working with children and their parents, is if there's a little bit of almost like a mismatch between parental need and desire for socialization and that of their child. So imagine how the energy pull it is for the parent of a younger child who needs their socialization to be mediated by the parent in the forms of organized play dates. When parent is more introverted or really kind of is doing okay without needing that much social interaction, parents definitely have shared that can be really hard for them because already they're navigating the pandemic as a whole. And now that, now for this, especially when school was totally closed, they found themselves trapped between this, I need to get socialization for my child, but I don't even have the energy to go ahead and do that. So I think it's something that also has to be looked at through that lens of self-compassion too, because I think parents become very, like most parents, the part that was the hardest for me throughout the pandemic was how upset we feel about how this is impacting our children. It's a scenario, it's a situation we have no power over. And so we're trying pretty hard to offset it, but at the same time, we're still human individuals bearing the weight of the pandemic as well. So my stance is one of fairly, moderation between trying to meet that need for your child, but also at the same time tuning into where your own social energy levels are as well. Because as a parent, if you end up with an empty tank, you kind of find yourself at that ground state where your distress tolerance and your patience is now completely spent. And then that ends up not being helpful for the child at home as well. And my final statement is, you noticed at the beginning in the introduction that, when I'm spending time with my family, we like to play board games. I am a big board game fan because that's a way to have fun and interact. It does not involve a screen. Even if you have 10 minutes, there are games you can play in 10 minutes. It doesn't have to be Monopoly. So finding alternate ways to spend time with the fam that doesn't, it's so not like we're all going to watch TV together or something like that, because it's one directional. Anything where you can just have some fun together is a good way to get at least your family socialization in each day as well.
Thank you so much. Oh, so many hard-hitting truths here. Nomsibo, we're going to give you the last word before we close out. Any final thoughts? But man, we're hearing stuff that we all need to go think about. Any
Right.
final thoughts?
Charles and Judith, have already touched on very important points, like just allowing, families to have that moment. And I think as parents, we are the ones that really need to to be exemplary, because we know that kids learn by observing their parents, where then they could see that there are other things that could be done as a family or as a unit just to have fun. And what I've noticed anyway as well with the young adults, they are pretty much creative, because they are the ones that even know these spaces of, even if really they have to be on social media or things like that, organizing whatever it is that is fun for them to interact. But like like what Charles has said, some people are extroverted, some are introverted. And for young adults, for those that tend to be introverted, they isolate a lot, and they are in their dorms and they are hiding, and it's very difficult to reach out, and they continue to say they want to social distance. So there's a lot that is going on in that, but with allowing, I guess, people to be aware that they can be creative and come up with activities and reach out and have fun, even if we're still dealing with the pandemic, that we can still find fun and still have ways to interact or to socialize with people, making sure that we maintain the standards that are out there, so that we don't become part of super spreaders. But of course, I think as families, I think that's what we also need to do, just setting examples and allowing our children as well to learn positive behavior.
Behaviors. Thank you so much, all of our panelists. This has been so enlightening. Christina, do you want to talk about the next office hours with health professionals? We're so glad, to hear from, and we definitely will. There's so much more to dig into, even with mental health. So we hope to have you back as a panel, or even some other programming where we can really do more community education around mental health. So we're so glad. Thank you so much. Christina, do you want to mention the next office hours?
Sure, please join us on Thursday, April 8th at 6 p.m. As we discuss how to stay healthy during the pandemic, youth vaccination efforts and the trials that are going on, and also how to prepare for the return to normalcy. Check out the website www.healthequitynorthland.org, and we will have that flyer available in a few days, and also the recording of this presentation. Thanks.
Thanks, Christina. And thanks everyone who came out and participated. Let others know that we have a recording, and they can find it at a website. So they also are able, they can also listen to it, or you can just, send them the link when it's up there. Just check the website in probably like a day or two, and so that they can, because I know this is just such great information that so many people need to hear. Thank you so much. This was really very enlightening and fun too. but hard hitting, I would say. As a parent, I'm just rechecking all my ways of parenting. Anyway, but it's good stuff. Thank you so much.
Excellent. No
Welcome.
problem. My
Thank
party
you,
work.
Judith.
Worry not about the parenting. Remember, it's a good enough parent.
Yeah,
There's a good
no,
enough
I'm making sure I'm balancing it, also taking the self-compassion part.
There you go.
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah, I'm like, I'm doing my best. Yeah.
Yes.
Nice.
We're all trying. So yeah,
Absolutely.
yeah, but it's good stuff.
Thank you, Nomsibo. Have a good one.
You too, Charles. You too,
Thanks, guys.
Judith.
Nice meeting you.
Yes, it was nice meeting you.
Good
Thank you.
session. Bye,
Okay.
Thanks,
everybody.
Okay.
Bye, Judith.
Bye-bye. Until next time.
Till
Right.
next time.
Bye, guys.
Bye-bye.
Really?